Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're going to be doing a video on my top 5 strategy and war games of 2021. This list is overdue. I usually try and put it out in early January. Obviously, we're almost to February, which is when I put my video out last year for this topic. So we're a bit late on this, but I did still want to talk about the games that I thought really stood out in 2021 from a strategy and wargaming perspective. Now, obviously, as with any top 5 list, this is going to be highly subjective and is only going to include games that I played a reasonable amount, because I can't really evaluate games that I didn't play or that I only played in passing. Additionally, in theory, games that are released toward the end of the prior year are eligible, but I think all of my games this year came out in this particular year, so that should be irrelevant. And then one other thing I'll say about this list is usually I struggle to narrow this list down to just 5. For whatever reason, it feels like 2021 was a bit of a lackluster year in strategy and wargaming. There were a couple of games that came out that I played a ton of, and we'll definitely be talking about those. Several of the games I played a lot this year actually came out toward the end of last year, and I would have included them in the list if it hadn't been for the fact that they were on the prior year's list. So Ultimate Admiral Age of Sail came out toward the, well, actually it was in early access. It launched officially this year, but it was on my list last year, so I wasn't going to include it again. Similarly, a game called Suzerain, which is sort of a political role-playing type game, came out toward the end of last year. I played most of it this year, but it was on my list last year as well, so I didn't include it in this list. But with that being said, that's enough preamble. Well, actually, one other quick thing. Because I can only include games that I played a reasonable amount, there were also games that came out toward the end of this year that may end up being on the list next year, but didn't quite cut the mustard this year because I just didn't have enough time with them. Games like Decisive Campaigns Ardennes, which got rave reviews, but I just really didn't play it very much. And then a game called The Troop, which I played the demo of and really enjoyed, but I haven't played the finished product yet. And so those are games that I'll keep an eye on and maybe include them in the 2022 list, but they didn't make the cut this year because I barely played them last year or didn't play them at all. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at my top 5 strategy and war games of 2021. At number 5, Cauldrons of War Stalingrad. Cauldrons of War Stalingrad is a sequel to a game that was on this list a couple of years ago, and that was Cauldrons of War Barbarossa. In Cauldrons of War Stalingrad, you are a commander of the entire Eastern Front from either the German or the Soviet perspective, and you fight through the key 1942 Battle of Stalingrad, as you would guess by the title. But the game goes far beyond just the Battle of Stalingrad. It's actually looking at basically the entire Eastern Front from the late spring up until, late 42, early 43, during basically Operation Fall Blau, which includes the drive into the Caucasus as well as the Battle of Stalingrad. And then the Soviet perspective, I believe, also includes the Soviet counteroffensive for the ultimate victory at Stalingrad. Now, what makes Cauldrons of War really stand out for me, and was one of the reasons that Barbarossa was on this list, is it does a much better job than most games of abstracting things that aren't super important to army or field commanders of a senior rank. And so what I mean by that is a lot of strategy games really fail because they engross you in the minutia. And I'm going to use War in the Pacific as an example of this. By the way, I love War in the Pacific. It's one of my favorite war games of all time, but I think the Gary Grigsby games are a good example of games where you get really ingrained in the detail in a way that doesn't make sense for the role that you're representing. And so, like, War in the Pacific, in theory, you're Admiral Nimitz, but you're also Admiral King, but you're also Admiral Halsey, and you're also, like, for whatever reason, dictating the location of individual battalions of infantry or squadrons of aircraft or individual merchant ships. Like, it gets you all the way down that level so that you're managing thousands and thousands of units across the entire Pacific theater. Now, depending on the gaming experience you're going for, that can work, but I think a lot of war games really fall into the pit of, hey, you're a field marshal, why are you telling this company of troops where to go? Or maybe abstracted a little bit, why are you telling this regiment or even this division where to go, how to launch a particular tactical attack, those kind of things. And what Cauldrons of War does is it abstracts a lot of that. Essentially, the way the game works is you have different operations which will exist in different theaters of the campaign. So you'll have like an Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South, and then you'll have an operation that army group is undertaking. And then you'll basically issue orders like, you know, you want them to launch a blitzkrieg attack, you want them to use their air power to resupply their troops, or you'll want to go ahead and make sure that they're, you know, shelling the enemy and then launching an infantry assault. So still probably more detail than a field marshal would really care about, but still abstracted out in a way where it's like you're not telling them to advance a mile, turn right, hit the enemy in the flank, and then move from there. You're not telling them to split their division into 3 regiments and move one around here and another over there. You are essentially giving orders at a corps or army level, and most of the time you're not even looking at divisions. Again, units are grouped in corps or whatever. So you're issuing these kind of top-level abstract commands where it's like you want to launch a breakthrough operation, and then you need to go ahead and take that objective. And you're given a certain number of command points every single turn, so that I think it's like a 2-week turn, basically. You have a certain amount of orders that you can issue that represent limitations around your ability to fight everywhere at the same time, because logistically you can't do that. Additionally, you do have logistical restraints around how many trucks are bringing supplies at an abstract level to the front line. So basically your troops can run out of ammunition, they can run out of fuel, and it can bog them down. And Cauldrons of War Barbarossa did a great job of this, looking at the initial German invasion. I thought the Soviet side of the game was a little bit weak, but overall I think it was a really interesting and challenging game to play from the German perspective. I was worried that Cauldrons of War Stalingrad would suffer from it being a more narrow operation. You know, you're not invading all of the USSR, you're primarily fighting in the south, and yet it does a really good job, and it also still brings in other aspects of things going around Leningrad, things going around on the Moscow front. You can even pull troops from those other sectors, but that does have consequences. And I think what really is what got it on my list this year is because in addition to all of that, they also implemented a new game mode for the Battle of Stalingrad itself. And so you have this overarching drive on Stalingrad at sort of the strategic level, but then there's also a scenario that allows you to basically jump into the Battle of Stalingrad, where the city of Stalingrad's broken up into different districts, and you have to manage moving your troops through the city to try and overrun the Soviets and take the city, just looking at kind of like a street-by-street view of the fight from a top level. So you're not a field marshal anymore. Maybe you're commanding the 6th Army or whatnot. And I think that really adds some new mechanics. It adds some new considerations. A lot of the core game is the same, but a lot of the individual orders or the way that you need to fight are very, very different in the city battle of Stalingrad. And so I think that scenario, including, you know, all the other parts of the game where you have the other scenarios which allow you to look at the entire front, are why this game got on the list. They did make some changes to the maps and graphics, which were a weak point of Cauldrons of War Barbarossa. I think it's still the game's weak point, but overall, this is really a game that I think does a lot of things differently. It makes you, you know, sort of make key decisions around how you're prioritizing resources, how you're, you know, either committing war crimes or not war crimes. It really does, I think, a good job of showing you the Eastern Front in 1942 during Operation Fall Blau, and also just, I think, a really well done game from the perspective of limited choices, not trying to do too much, and trying to convey the strategic position, both at the battle perspective when you're looking at just the city, or if you're looking at the overarching campaign. The game is developed by Maestro Syntec, and it is published by Gaming at Work. It's a very small studio. I think it's a one-man job. And I have a link in the description if you're interested in picking it up. It's one of those small and yet surprisingly complex and interesting games. And I am kind of the champion of this series all the time whenever I talk about it. Maybe a little over enthusiastic. I mean, the game does have its limitations, but certainly within the context of 2021, Cauldrons of War Stalingrad is my number 5 game of 2021. At number 4, Field of Glory 2 Medieval. Field of Glory 2 Medieval is developed by Byzantine Games and published by Slytherin. This is a turn-based war game that really is designed and built to feel like you're playing this on a tabletop. It's structurally a tabletop war game. It looks at the Middle Ages from 1040 AD to 1270 AD, so the high Middle Age period. And the previous Field of Glory 2 Medieval was more, well, I guess it wasn't medieval. It was Field of Glory 2, and it was focused more on sort of the ancients or the Roman period. But in Field of Glory 2 Medieval, you introduce everything that comes with medieval warfare. You're looking at things like crossbows, cavalry, all the, the relevant heavy cavalry like knights and stuff like that. All the stuff that you kind of think about when you think about the Middle Ages. And I guess, what really makes this game stand out is, one, I love the art style. I think this game, it really is evocative of a tabletop type game with those really bright and vibrant colors that you might imagine if you were painting these models. I think it does a great job of showing the limitations of command, especially once units hit each other. So it is turn-based. It's I go, you go. So you issue your orders, your troops move. The other side issues their orders, their troops move. And it really is evocative of some of the limitations in command in linear warfare in this age. Formations are not maneuverable. Cavalry does not turn on a dime. Spearmen, once they're engaged, good luck addressing a threat to your flank. You're going to have to hope that you can bring other troops up to cover that flank. And so you've got these big linear, unwieldy formations that then crash into each other. And then the battle often takes kind of a life of its own. You've got to mix in tactics, whether you're using ranged weapons, whether you're using melee, cavalry, whatever it may be. Even in some of the battles have some relics, like religious relics, like the pieces of the true cross or the things like that, which can give morale bonuses to troops. As long as your troops maintain their cohesion, they're usually not going to get chopped up too bad. But once those troops lose their cohesion, once they start to break, the casualties really start to skyrocket. This is a really challenging game, at least for me, to be very good at. I find myself getting, slaughtered quite a bit. It has a very good multiplayer mode where you can play. It's basically like a play by email plus, so you're not actually sending any emails to anybody. You're just trading them on the servers of Slytherin, the turns back and forth. And I think it's really seamless. I played in one of their tournaments, which they run. They kind of have a bunch of different tournaments that they run through the company against some other content creators. I played against Lionheart, and it was just a lot of fun. I don't have a lot else to say about this other than I think it's a great medieval game for a tabletop setting. It came out this year. I played it quite a bit, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I guess if there's one reason that I would point to that it wouldn't be higher on the list is while the individual tactical battles are exceptional, and that's really what you've been watching here, the game's campaign system is not very compelling to me. It's mostly sort of sandbox campaigns with linked battles, and I would much rather some sort of dynamic historical campaign rather than sort of almost like a deck builder campaign. At least that's how it feels to me. And so I'm not a big fan of the campaign structure, but otherwise it's a great game. So at number 4, Field of Glory 2 Medieval. At number 3 on my list is Grand Tactician, The Civil War, developed by Oliver Keppelmuller and self-published by the same name. This is an incredibly ambitious game, which I played a ton of on my channel, and I have somewhat complex feelings about, but I definitely think it deserves its place on this list. How best to describe Grand Tactician, The Civil War? It is a grand strategy game that puts you in charge of either the Union or the Confederacy, where you have to raise armies, make political decisions around different acts, whether you want to fund your forces by implementing some new budgetary laws or rules, whether you want to change your military policies so that you enable longer enlistments, or whether you want to, increase the manpower pool that you can build units from by instituting a draft. It has a complex economic system where your economy kind of runs in the background and uses, basic economic principles around supply and demand to draw resources in. Maybe it's a munitions factory and they need iron. So then they've got to purchase iron on the open market. They've got to purchase steel. They've got to purchase gunpowder, all these other things. That price fluctuates based on demand. Demand can be influenced by the enemy raiding, a gunpowder mill. It could be influenced by you deciding to pass certain economic policies. It could be influenced by you raising more troops, creating shortages of different goods. A very complex economic system that frankly is hard to understand why things are happening. Like, it's really big and it's there, but I do wonder sometimes how much the system is really responding to the dynamics on the map versus some sort of predefined, it's just going to do this. It's hard to tell because there is so much information. There are so many different elements or variables or traits or whatever in the economy, but it's really hard to see why things are going the way they are. You can more directly influence it by balancing different industrial policies or finance policies or other things like that. But your actual control over the economy is pretty limited other than, when you take over certain enemy factories, that obviously has an impact on the economy. In addition to sort of this grand strategy or the strategic layer of the game also has a tactical layer. So I mentioned you raise armies, you assign commanders, you organize them as you see fit by laying out your orders of battle and your divisions and whatever. But when two armies meet, then you get to fight a tactical battle. And so the tactical battles can be resolved on historical battlefields. If your armies meet where a historical battlefield occurred, then you'll actually fight on that particular map. And that's pretty neat. And if you're in a place where there wasn't a historical battle, there are, I believe, some additional stock or standard maps that can get drawn up. Or if you're close enough, you may just get pulled into whatever the closest historical battle is. So sometimes you fight the Battle of Bull Run 4 or 5 times in Northern Virginia, or the Battle of Shiloh multiple times in Tennessee on different places on the map. But generally speaking, they've done a good job of expanding the amount of maps and adding a little bit of variability to the maps. I really love the art style behind the tactical battle maps. So when you zoom out, you kind of see your army in like atlas or block style, where you've got like red lines or blue lines representing units. When you zoom in, you actually can see your troops. It was in 2D, but I guess it's in 3D now. There was a recent patch that came out. And you can see them marching around on the map, firing at the enemy, smoke, sound, all of the sights and sounds of the battlefield that you would expect are in the battlefields. And so you have this really interesting dynamic where you move armies around on the strategic map, you fight the battles on the tactical map, and the results there directly influence the strategic map once the game sort of pulls you out of the battlefield. And in that sense, it has a bit of a Total War type feel to it. I think where the game struggles, at least up to this point, and I know they've released a few patches even in just the last couple of weeks, but up to this point, I'd say the AI is pretty bad, especially on the tactical battles. Like I almost never lost tactical battles. I think part of the problem is these maps tend to be really large for the amount of troops that you have involved. And that makes it really easy when you have a passive AI that doesn't take advantage of your mistakes. It makes it really easy to just, find the enemy, move around their flank. If they withdraw, who cares? You'll just follow them. And if they stay put, then you'll hit them in the flank. And so it makes it really easy to find vulnerable enemy positions. The AI rarely has like a unit hidden behind a tree, or not a tree, but like hidden in a wood line, maybe to the right of their flank. So then if you try and move around the flank, then they hit you in your flank. Like that would be kind of an interesting thing to occur. Never really heard about it happening in the Civil War quite like that. But, the game has to have certain methods or mechanics to draw you into the enemy line so that you're not always marching around their flank. That seemed a little bit too easy to do. So maybe the AI just needs to do a better job of anchoring on certain positions. It does refuse its flank from time to time. So like the AI does respond to what you're doing. But generally speaking, the tactical AI is not great. The strategic AI is pretty bad as well. I think the major problem I have there is just that it seems like armies and units get raised based on events that occur. And I don't feel like once you trounce an enemy army that they pull back and resupply. It feels like they just kind of pull back and they've taken the losses they take, and they'll regain some of them through walking wounded and whatnot, returning to service. But you're never really going to see them like reorganize or build a new army of the same unit. It's just going to wait till maybe a new policy passes and a new army gets raised. Like the AI does a bad job of merging crippled units or reorganizing its own forces. And so once you get that first victory against any particular army, it seems like it's pretty easy to just kind of keep it rolling. That being said, I did put this game at number 3 for a reason. And the real reason is, I mean, it is ambitious, it is big, it is one of a kind, and despite the limitations of the AI, I found myself absolutely loving raising troops, assigning commanders, watching those commanders perform, sometimes watching them fail and become, hated by the press or by their soldiers. And, then you replace them or sometimes keep them in command anyway. That influences morale, watching commanders' fame ebb and flow based on the war, having the whole naval element of the war in the game as well. The ability to blockade ports, take coastal ports. There is no other Civil War game like this aside from at least any quasi-modern Civil War game like this, aside from maybe Age-odd Civil War II, but that's not even close to Grand Tactician because Grand Tactician has the tactical battles that Age-odd lacks. And so I think it's a one-of-a-kind game. I hope they continue to improve it. I hope they continue to make enhancements. They've come a long way since they first entered early access, and I definitely think this is in the top 3 games of this year, even with all of its flaws and the different areas that I think definitely need to be improved. But we'll see how it develops. We'll see how they continue to patch and improve the game. And I'm hopeful that this, in a year or two time, who knows, maybe this will become known as the greatest Civil War game of all time, because it is trying to be. I don't think it's there yet, but it is trying to be. And it's really encouraging to see. But we'll see how that unfolds. And that's going to have rambled on enough about number 3. So let's go ahead and move on to number 2 on our list. At number 2, War in the East 2 by 2x3 Games and published by Slytherin. This is a war game of the grandest scale and tradition. War in the East 2, as you would guess from the title, is the sequel to War in the East 1. And this game looks at the Eastern Front during World War II, putting you in the shoes of basically either the high command of the German or the Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. It starts with the German invasion of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, and goes, I think, theoretically into early 1946, if the game requires it. Or maybe it's the fall of 45, I'm not sure. It lets you go past the historical date by a few months, but not a huge amount. And this is a game that fights through the Eastern Front in an I go, you go format. So the game has multiple phases. It has an air phase where you issue orders to air groups. Maybe you want your aircraft to interdict enemy units in a given area. Maybe you want to draw a custom box of where you want to draw combat air patrols to gain air superiority over your own troops to ensure the enemy can't bomb you. Maybe you want to do bombing of individual units or other things like that. You can do a lot of different things within the air operation phase, and there's a lot of customization in it. And then once you issue those orders, they are resolved, and then you move on to the ground phase. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the I go, you go format because it does lead to some strange feelings of how the war is fought. It's like, well, the Germans get to attack first and do their blitzkrieg and run out and form these pockets. And then you as the Soviets get to bomb them and see how the bombing goes. And then you get to issue your orders for the ground units. I don't think it's, from my experience with War in the Pacific, the best way to model combat, but it is a more approachable way to model a game of this scale. And I think that's definitely what they're going for. And in that sense, I think they accomplished their end objective. When you try and do the entire Eastern Front with units of brigade or division size, and you really zoom in on the entire theater in the scale that this game has it. I mean, this is a massive game. Hundreds upon hundreds of hexes, of cities, of towns, multiple different types of roadways, complex logistics, production being modeled as well. This is a game that is very detailed and very big. And so anytime you have a game like that, if you're trying to appeal to a wider audience, that's a major challenge. And so one way you can do that is you can break the phases up into multiple different segments, and that makes things easier. There's also an incredible amount of customization around if you want the AI to manage certain things for you, you can do that as well. And I don't think it's out yet, but at least the manual references a multiplayer ability where you can assign different players to different commands within a given game, which would be really cool if you could do like a co-op where each one of you commands an army group or against other humans as well. That would be really neat. When I was playing it a lot closer to release, that capability wasn't in yet. I'd have to dive back in and see if it's in the game yet or not. But yeah, I mean, this game, I don't know what else to say. I mean, you have pools of equipment, of units, your different variants of T-34s, and their production is modeled. Infantry and their replacements are modeled. Off-map combat is modeled to represent pressures of other fronts that are occurring or reinforcement pools that the Soviets can bring to bear. I need more time to formulate my more complex thoughts around this game, and frankly, I need more time to devote to this game. I was on the fence of whether I would include it in my list because while I've played it a fair amount of hours, I still am learning. I mean, this thing has, it's over a 300-page full color hardcover manual or hardback manual if you want it. I mean, this is a production. And so, it's quite the game. It's quite the manual. And I think it's the kind of thing that I'd have to play a lot of for 6 to 12 months to really feel like I know it as well as I know some of the other games on this list. But in terms of sheer scope of the Eastern Front, I mean, this is one of those games that if it was a board game, it would take up an entire garage because it's so big. And then you would play turns, like multiple real life days would be one turn because it would be so big. I think some of the streamlining they've done, the enhanced air features, which I believe are pulled over from War in the West, and some of the other quality of life improvements they've made to the UI to make this game more approachable, have done a reasonable job there. But of any game of this size and scope, it's going to be only for a certain subset of people. With that being said, I do think the enhancements that they've made, the scale of this game, the overall impression and sort of what I think is a pretty good looking game for a game of this size, they've all done a remarkable job. And while this is by no means a final verdict on my thoughts on the game, because again, I need to spend more time on it, it definitely belongs on this list. And I think it belongs at number 2 for very good reasons. And so War in the East 2 is my number 2 game of 2021, my number 2 strategy and war game of 2021. And that leaves us with just one more game. So without further ado, what is my top game of 2021? At number 1 is a game called War on the Sea, which is developed by Killerfish Games. And this is a World War II war game that takes place in the South Pacific during the Guadalcanal campaign. So this is a game that I think does some really interesting things. You could say it's loosely inspired by Task Force 1942, perhaps, of old Microprose days. But basically, this is a game where you are in charge of either the American or the Japanese navies during World War II in the South Pacific during the fall and into the winter of 1942. And you basically are going to form task forces of warships with the objective of gaining control of the sea around various South Pacific islands. Your end objective is to take Guadalcanal and several other islands in the area to build up airfields so that you're able to exert your control over that area and to defeat any enemy attempt to take the islands away from you. And so with Japan, you already own Guadalcanal, and so you need to reinforce it and build it up and hold out against the American onslaught against you. As the Americans, you need to take Guadalcanal back from the Japanese, as well as several neighboring islands, and then deal with Japanese attempts to counterattack and take it back from you as well. And so this is a game that has a real-time campaign map in the Solomons and in the South Pacific. And when units do converge on the same spot on the map, then you have naval battles. This is a game that includes 3D naval battles during the Guadalcanal campaign, and it also does include land and air combat. Now, the land combat is all abstracted, so you kind of get a number of your troops, you have an amount of supply those troops have, and the troops fight more efficiently if they have sufficient supplies, less efficiently if they're running out of supplies. And it's kind of a numbers game against the enemy and whatnot. And so your overall objective is obviously to take those bases, but you don't actually fight the land battles out. You do fight the naval battles and you do fight the air battles. And so this is, without a doubt, my top game of the year. I played it a ton at the beginning of the year. The game was a little bit rough when it first came out. It lacked, I think, some clear understanding of how the game was played, of what was occurring on the map. It was, I think, hamstrung by, forces would get sucked in that would just essentially you could end up fighting a campaign where every single warship in the Japanese Navy was sunk in the Guadalcanal campaign. Like, it just kept going because the original version of the game, the only end state was taking the bases. It had nothing to do with damage inflicted on the enemy navies. They did make some changes and some patches that now, once you sink a certain amount of enemy ships, the game assumes that the enemy will give up on sending more troops south and you'll win. And so, there is that aspect. I enjoy the logistical side of things as well in this game because you only have a certain amount of troops. You only get a certain amount of reinforcements I think it's every week or every 2 weeks. And so you have to decide where you're going to allocate your infantry, where you're going to allocate your supplies, your fuel, your engineers, and the different resources that you need to build these bases up. And if ships are in transit and they get sunk by the enemy, then you delay your campaign substantially because you've just lost those resources and you don't just instantly get them back. So this is really a game about building up your resources, building up your ground troops, launching them at your objectives with sufficient force, taking the base and then reinforcing it so that you can use land-based aircraft to bomb enemy shipping and not just be limited to your own shipping. You have aircraft carriers in the game that allows you to fight aircraft carrier battles. You've got battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, submarines. And so it really becomes a game about setting some kind of barrier so that the enemy can't send reinforcements into the islands and that you sink the merchants or the warships that may be trying to come south or north. And then, getting your own troops onto the island and grinding the enemy away, very much like the Guadalcanal campaign was in history. And I think, we have very few Pacific war games today. I play a lot of War in the Pacific, but that's a decade-plus old game, and it's a turn-based game. This is, I think, the best done real-time naval war game in World War II that I've played in, a really long time. Maybe Silent Hunter, if you're going to go back further, would have been better, but that was a completely different scope and scale and type of game. Victory at Sea Pacific was a buggy mess and wasn't terribly enjoyable, and I think tried to do way too much. Whereas one of the things I like about War on the Sea is it has a narrower focus, and I think they do a really good job with that. Killerfish was the studio behind Cold Waters, although I believe the studio has broken up so that this isn't the exact same team. I think it's one of the main individuals. And then they also were behind a game called Atlantic Fleet, which was an interesting turn-based World War II game looking at the Battle of the Atlantic. There are some really good mods out for War on the Sea. The Tokyo Express mod comes to mind, which helps, I think, remedy some of the game's flaws. And I think this is definitely one of those games that I'll be coming back to in 2022 and covering it in a little more depth and seeing how the game evolves. But I've really enjoyed my time with it. And it's definitely been the number one game in terms of playtime for me on this list. And so, I put it at number one. It did, again, it wasn't without its flaws. That's one of the interesting things this year with the games that came out is that there really wasn't a perfect game. I had major reservations with every single game in this list, with the exception of maybe Field of Glory Medieval. Every game at different times presented me with some major reservations. And yet, I think of all of these games, this is the game that I'll probably come back to the most and play the most, with maybe the exception of War on these two once I really dig my teeth into it and learn it top to bottom, and if Grand Tactician gets their AI sorted out. Overall, though, an interesting year for war and strategy games, and that is my top 5 list of war and strategy games in 2021. What were your top 5 games? Leave them in the comments down below, and I'd be happy to check them out. Maybe we can have a little discussion there. But overall, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave your thoughts down below. Let me know if you agree with the list or not. And as always, until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying once again, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, I'm out.